Hello, my name is Carl Money. I'm one of the Senior Analytical Managers for Mental Health within NHS England NHS Improvement. And this recording is the first of 3 sessions we have to provide more information on the Mental Services Dataset, or the MHSDS. So session 1, which is today's session, will cover an introduction to the dataset. Session 2 will cover how the MHSDS is stored in the NCDR. And session 3 will include some real-life examples of queries that the team have received recently, and we'll kind of demo how to write code in SQL to extract data from the MHSDS. So in terms of today's session then, we will be covering 4 things. The first one is what is the MHSDS? The second is we'll talk about the structure, data model, and the technical output specification and user guide. Section 3 will cover the submission process, so how data gets from local services into the MHSDS and then onto us at NHS England, and then how some examples of what you can use the MHSDS for. So we'll kick off with an introduction to what the MHSDS is. So the Mental Health Services Dataset is owned and managed by NHS Digital. It collects personal level data from health records of the individual children, young people, adults and older adults who are in contact with mental health and learning disability services. The data is reused for purposes other than their direct care, so that's what we call a secondary usage dataset. It defines data items, definitions and information extracted or derived from those local information systems. So there's an information standards notice, and that mandates the collection of the data set, but also the individual data items within there. Submission to the MHSDS is mandatory where a person's care is NHS funded in part or in whole. Organisations who receive no NHS funding can submit the MHSDS, but it is optional, and as you can imagine, we see very few of those. There is a link on the bottom of that slide, which will take you to much more information around the background. It'll include links to the ISN and some of the files we will be talking about in a little bit later. So the MHSDS is regularly updated. So version 5 of the MHSDS is due to go live on the 1st of October, so in a few days' time. And it's updated very regularly. It is typically annually updated, so we will add new data items or remove data items and/or tables. And this is to ensure that the dataset is kept fit for purpose. Unfortunately, with COVID, we've moved into an 18-month update cycle, but we're hoping to get back to annual process soon. We'll make those changes in essence to make sure that the dataset is fit for purpose and will allow us to monitor ambitions in the 5-year view and long-term plan through nationally mandated datasets rather than commissioning bespoke collections, which increases burden on the system. The MHSDS is increasingly using clinical terminology as a way around kind of some of the delays in those kind of updates to the dataset, and that's primarily through SNOMED CT. As I said, it allows the dataset to be much more responsive to change, and it enables greater interoperability between systems and settings. So, in short, any organisation that delivers NHS-funded care for a person's mental health or wellbeing, excluding adult IAP services, is in scope of the MHSDS. So it's those large organisations you'd expect, so NHS trusts, and they account for around 95% of all the activity reported. But what we're seeing increasingly is that there are a number of voluntary care services, independent sector organisations, councils and charities submitting data to the MHSDS because they receive NHS money. And NHS Digital receives submissions for over 300 organisations each month, typically. So what services does the MHSDS kind of cover? Inpatient services, and by inpatient services we mean acute inpatient care, psychiatric intensive care units, learning disability and autism inpatient care, specialist inpatient care, along with forensic and secure inpatient care services. It also includes community services, so those mental health services that are delivered primarily via the community, and they include things like community mental health teams, crisis teams, children and young people specific teams, lots of specialist services, and then triage and single points of access as well. And we'll get onto kind of the structure and the underlying kind of nature of the MHSDS, but ultimately it allows us to track people between settings as well. So as I'm sure you picked up, it's an incredibly broad data set that covers an awful lot of clinical settings, and we can do that primarily because of the kind of the structure of the MHSDS. While it is a fairly complex relational data set, there are almost 60 tables and around 1,000 individual data items. It's modular, so groups of tables may or not be submitted depending on the services that that particular provider offers. The MHSDS is referral based, so as I was saying earlier, it allows us to track kind of individual clinical pathways and how they interact with each other. And the data model, which accompanies each version of the MHSDS, is a pictorial representation of this data structure. And this is the data model for version 4. So this is the input data model. So it will include a number of data items that we at NHS England don't receive, things like NHS number, the full postcode, that person's date of birth, which are obviously identifiable and incredibly sensitive data items, but we'll come on to in future sessions kind of how we work around those restrictions via derivations and things. Big C, the data model is color coded, and there is a color key as well. And what that means is that it really highlights the modular nature of the MHSDS. So if we were to look, for example, at the patient details, so that's that yellow set just in the top middle of the data model. If we zoom in on those, we can see that we include things like the master patient index, which contains lots of information about that person, their ethnicity, their NHS number, their gender, their marital status, lots of kind of demographic information. We also have bits of information that relate directly to that person that wouldn't change depending on the referral that that person has. So it's things like the accommodation status, employment status, their GP, a number of kind of patient indicators, whether they're ex-British Armed Forces, whether they're a looked after child. That person's care coordinator, if they have a particularly complex set of needs, whether they have a disability or they need any assistive technology, and if that person has a care plan for their care in that particular provider. Moving back to the data model, the next section is the kind of the lilac bit, which is the core of the MHSDS, and that is around the referral. So a person may have more than one referral, and it's worth remembering as well that a person may be seen by more than one provider at the same time. So that's where the kind of the modular nature of the MHSDS I think is really, really helpful, because we can track not only those individual pathways, but then kind of piece them together across settings, really, to have a really good understanding of how that person kind of interacts with mental health services. So the big table in the middle is the actual referral itself. That tells us where that referral came from, the main reason for that referral, when that referral closed, when that person was discharged. But then we also have a lot of information kind of hanging around that, which is around the discharge plan, the type of service that referral was linked to. So typically we see a one-to-one relationship between the service and the referral. But in other settings, I think the community data set, for example, you could have multiple teams working as part of the same referral. We don't really see that in the MHSDS. It is a much more of a one-to-one relationship between that 102 table and the referral itself. There is a referral to treatment table, which we don't use, and is being retired for version 5. And there's an onward referral table, so we can say once that referral has been closed, we can then see kind of which service that person was referred onwards to and which organisation as well. About the data model, so the next section is around care contacts and care activities. So that's the kind of the light purple bit in the bottom right-hand corner of the data model. And this is where all of the activity that takes place. So you'll see that it was linked to the referral. So each referral can have a multiple bits of activity associated with it. We have the care contact table, which talks about kind of the consultation type, whether it was face-to-face, telephone, more online consultation mechanisms are becoming much more popular as well, whether the contact was attended or not, those kind of things. And then hanging off that table is the 202 care activity table, which is where we'll first come across SNOMED. So each care contact may have multiple care activities associated with it. So for example, a person may have an initial assessment as part of one contact, but then move into kind of thinking about kind of treatment plans, or there may be some physical health checks that take place there as well. So that is a one-to-many relationship between the care contact and the care activity table. We also have something called indirect activity, and I think the best example of indirect activity is if a child or young person is accessing mental health services, that clinician may speak to that children's or that child or young person's teacher about their care, about their kind of how well they're doing at school and things. So that's not directly involving the child, but it's about their care. So that's where that indirect activity comes from. And there's also an other in attendance, and that would capture, for example, if a parent or carer attended an appointment as well. We also have much more kind of SNOMED recording. That's in this green clinical coded terminology section. So we have a number of diagnosis fields. We have the medical history, so previous diagnoses, diagnoses that were made out before this current referral. We have provisional, primary and secondary diagnoses, which can be recorded in ICD-10 or SNOMED. Then we also have the coded scored assessments. So outcome assessments, whether that's common things like HONOS or more specific things like the GAD or PHQ, can be recorded in three ways, on three tables. There's the coded scored assessment table, which links to the referral. The coded scored assessment table linked to a specific piece of activity. And there's also the anonymous self-assessment. So what we'd see typically there is patient experience measures, for example, flowing through that table. So not linked to a specific referral, but still around that service. Next is the inpatient section. So that's the pink section on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And how this section or this module, if you like, of the dataset works is that there is a hospital provider spell. So that's the overarching kind of stay within hospital for that person in that provider. Within that, there can be multiple ward stays, so they could move wards frequently, and then bits of activity kind of hang off that as well. So we've got the commissioner, so who is responsible for the payment of that hospital spell. We've got the delayed discharge, although with COVID and the shift away from the link between local authorities and mental health services, we think that we'll no longer need to kind of capture delayed discharges because that responsibility will lie solely with the healthcare provider. We've got restrictive interventions, so where people are restrained, whether that's chemically or mechanically through handcuffs, that can be recorded there. If there's any instances of substance misuse or patient-to-patient assaults, that's recorded. Instances of self-harm are also there, and then bits of information around trial leave under the Mental Health Act or home leave for those people who aren't detained are captured there as well. Next is kind of linked to that, so that's the Mental Health Act. So that's the light pink group in the top right corner of the screen. So what we have there is the Mental Health Act table in the middle. So that's the Mental Health Act legal status classification period. So each detention under the Mental Health Act or each episode under the Mental Health Act is recorded there. So a person may be detained under more than one section, and they may be detained under the same section more than once as well. We have the responsible clinician, so that's typically a psychiatrist who is responsible legally for that person's care. Conditional discharge, community treatment orders, and community treatment recall. So they are kind of linked to the Mental Health Act in that there would be kind of, as the name suggests, there will be a conditional discharge and community treatment orders, which are where people are discharged from hospital, but are still under the Mental Health Act and can be recalled to hospital there. And again, we've got kind of the absence without leave and leave of absence tables as well, which link back to the hospital spell table. So there's an awful lot of information there. As I said, the MHSDS is a fairly large and quite complex data set if you're using it for the first time. The most helpful thing you can look at when you are analysing data is the the MHSDS technical output specification. It's an Excel file which has a tab for each table and information on each data item. So its format, if there's a national code list, the options there, along with any validations and exclusions that are applied when the data is first submitted to the SDCS portal, NHS Digital. It also contains a lookup table for assessments, a change log, so you can see when data items were added or removed from the MHSDS, and table linkage guidance as well. But we will cover that in much more detail when we talk about how the MHSDS lives inside the NCDR. It also includes information on file, table, and data item level rejections. And there's a link in the slide pack as well, which I hope will accompany the video. But I've got an example here. So this is the master patient index table, and you can see that there are a number of data items that we've highlighted, or we've kind of zoomed in on. There's the local patient identifier, the organisation that has created that or cares for that person. The organisation identifier of residence responsibility, that's a very posh way of saying the CCG based on that person's postcode. If they're in school, the organisation identifier of their school, the NHS number and the NHS number status. That's just a subset of the data items that are in this table. And you can see along the bottom, there's a tab for each individual table. Also really helpful is the MHSDS user guide. So that's a PDF of guidance for each table and often individual data items. It includes the history of the MHSDS scope changes and format changes. It outlines how the MHSDS should be used and interpreted by users, system suppliers, and other stakeholders. And it provides additional information on the data groups and data items, along with additional guidance regarding the extraction and analysis of the dataset. And here is an example from the accommodation status table. So from this, we will know that one group or one occurrence of this group is permitted, containing the most recently recorded accommodation details. What that means is that the latest accommodation status for that person in that provider is submitted in that month. That's basically what it means. And then we've got different, then there are additional notes on data items as well. So if the accommodation status code, you can see it's hyperlinked. So that's a NHS data dictionary national code list. So click on that, will take you to that page there. Similarly for the settled accommodation indicator and the accommodation status recorded date. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the structure, data model, TOS, and user guide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the submission process. So the MHSDS contains a lot of information. There's information around kind of telephone contacts, face-to-face contacts, group sessions, prescriptions, lab tests, physical health checks, hospital stays, outcome assessments, and again, kind of more pharmacological interventions as well. But that information locally is stored in a number of ways. It can be stored in Excel, could be stored in that organization's patient administration system, and unfortunately still on paper records. So there's an awful lot of work that goes into combining all of that information across those different sources, and bearing in mind as well that providers or organizations may have more than one PAS system as well. So trying to get those to talk to each other is in a consistent way is quite a challenge. But all of that information feeds into what's called the intermediate database, or IDB. And this is a Microsoft Access file that providers or organizations would submit on a monthly basis to the SDCS Cloud at NHS Digital. Once a month, there's a lot of processing. You'll see the processing is in the cloud now that it's the SDCS Cloud. And then from the cloud will fall the publications that NHS Digital produce on a monthly basis. They also produce some aggregate extracts for other organizations, and we, along with a couple of other organizations, receive a record level extract. So as I said, data is submitted to the MHSDS on a monthly basis, and unlike some of the other data sets you may be familiar with, it includes all data relevant to the reporting period, so not just finished episodes. And that is a really, really important thing to stress, because quite often when people start to query the MHSDS who are new to it, they will overcount things because they expect that a referral will only be flowed once it's finished, and that simply isn't the case. So I've got an example here. We're going to talk about referrals, but this applies to anything what we call episodic, so anything that covers more than one specific date. So as an example, a care contact, that is a discrete bit of activity that takes place on a specific day and a specific time. Admissions to hospital, referrals, detention under the Mental Health Act, they span more than one date, so they are what we call episodic. So we would receive that information every single month that episodic activity takes place. So as an example, we have 6 months here. Let's say that I am referred to a mental health service and my referral covers all of those 6 months. In month 1, we would just see the referral from the start date to the end of month 1. In month 2, we would see that referral again with the start date back in month 1. In month 3, because my referral is still open, we will see that referral again, but again, it would have the same start date back in month 1. And that kind of continues all the way to month 6. So within the MHSDS, if we were to look at 6-month submissions for the organization that I was referred to, you will see 6 records of my referral. And we'll talk in later sessions how best to deal with that, whether we take the latest. So the latest information will be the one from month 6. Or what we typically do is we report kind of lots of analysis through time series. So we would kind of take each month as its own kind of snapshot almost, and we would report the fact that I had a referral in each of those 6 months that referral existed. But again, don't worry too much about it for now. In terms of the detail, we'll cover that much more when we talk about kind of how the data lives in the NCDR and how to query it. But just to stress that unlike SUS, it doesn't just include finished episodes. Any activity that's still ongoing is part of the MHSDS and will be submitted and will be stored in the NCDR. So until recently, there were only two opportunities to submit data to the MHSDS, and they were called the primary and refresh. So providers, organisations that submit the data have two bites of the cherry. And once that refresh window closed, you could not go back and change that data. With the move to the SDCS cloud, there were a couple of technical issues with that, which meant that for a number of months, providers couldn't submit their data. So working with NHS Digital, we implemented what's called the multiple submission window, which allows providers to submit previous data at any point in the financial year under certain circumstances. So, for example, if a new provider comes on stream and as part of their standard contract, they realise that they have to submit data to the MHSDS, they would be able to resubmit data for the full financial year rather than just at the point that they were able to technically submit the data. Similarly, if a significant kind of issue was identified in that provider submission for that month, they could resubmit that data. So that, for example, is bad data quality if a service was not able to provide data, that kind of thing. The resubmission of a particular month's data may also have resulted in earlier months' data now being incorrect. So if some referrals were discovered that hadn't been submitted, they would then go back and resubmit that referral for all of the months that it was active within that kind of financial year. So what that looks like as a kind of a crosstab is, so we've got the data month. So that would be the month that the data has been submitted for. And then the reporting period is that submission window. So in April, for example, because it's the start of the financial year, you only get one chance to submit. There's only one month you can submit in April. For the May submission window, you could submit data for April and May because that's part of the same financial year. That kind of progresses across until we get to the end of the year where we see providers resubmitting pretty much all of their data if they so wish. And that's to kind of, as I said, fix data quality issues if a provider was kind of coming on stream mid-year. But that does mean that in March, providers still only get kind of one bite of the cherry to get their March data right compared to the 13 times they have to get their April data right. But again, unlike us, once it's past that financial year cut off, you can't then go back and resubmit data from like 4 or 5 years ago. It is just limited to that current financial year because we're really keen the providers get their data right first time, or as close to the first time as possible. So that's a bit around the submission process. So we're gonna, for this last bit, talk about what you can use the MHSDS for, and then do a bit of kind of common myth busting around data quality and things. So the MHSDS has a number of uses, which includes commissioning services. So commissioners gain extracts of the MHSDS as well. Clinical audit, I'm working with a couple of researchers around the early intervention psychosis pathway to maximise the use of the MHSDS within clinical audit and research. Service planning, so as part of the long-term plan, we were able to use the MHSDS to help policy teams to predict how many people could access particular services, for example. Inspection and regulation, the CQC are pretty heavy users of the MHSDS, and it's really valuable for them to understand, particularly around the Mental Health Act and those kind of legal, the legal things that they're responsible for. They use the MHSDS for that. Monitoring government policy and legislation. I think I've talked about long-term plan a couple of times now, but that's the main driver for us, and that kind of really sets the trajectory for our work. Local and national performance management and benchmarking. So lots of our analysis and lots of our dashboards is fed into kind of performance packs and allows organizations and teams to kind of benchmark themselves. And that again kind of feeds into the national reporting and analysis bit. So lots and lots of uses. But as I'd said a couple of times now, again, it is a fairly complex data set, and there are a number of assumptions people often make when they analyze the MHSDS that they think then is an issue with the data set itself, and that's really not the case. So I've covered the bit around kind of how episodic data is handled differently in the MHSDS as it is in SUS, and again, that's a similar thing for maternity, I think, community data sets as well. But people often talk in fairly general terms about the data quality of the MHSDS, and that's a tricky thing to kind of quantify, really, because as I said, there are 60 tables and there are kind of over 1,000 data items. Some of those are worse than others in terms of their quality and their coverage, but in terms of like monitoring activity, We, when we triangulate with other data sources, when we count referrals, when we count people, when we count activity, we are pretty close or there or thereabouts to what local areas kind of understand to be their caseload or how much activity they perform every month. So while things like SNOMED and the recording of outcomes aren't as good as we'd like them to be, it certainly doesn't limit the uses of the MHSDS. And as I said, if people do have specific concerns about data quality, then there are a raft of resources and people we can talk to kind of explore those. But yeah, data quality isn't that big of an issue when we're looking at activity, and I don't think it should stop you from using the MHSDS in any way. So that's it for today. We'll be putting together the next slide, which is around how the MHSDS lives in the NCDR, and I will speak to you all soon. Thanks.